The bulldozer sat silent in the overgrown yard of 47 Maple Street, its metal teeth caked with mud and regret. Jake Reaper Morrison wiped grease from his tattooed hands, ignoring the whispers from across the street. The neighbors thought he'd lost his mind, a leather-clad Hell's Angels member trying to rebuild the crumbling Victorian where his wife Sarah had grown up. They called it a fool's errand, a desperate man's delusion. But Sarah had made him promise. With her dying breath, she'd begged him to restore the house, to make it beautiful again. The cancer had taken her voice, but her eyes had burned with urgency he still didn't understand. 6 months of back-breaking work later, Jake's German shepherd, Diesel, started acting strange. The dog would dig frantically in the basement corner, whimpering and pawing at the concrete foundation. When Jake finally broke through the old cement, Diesel's nose led him to a metal box buried 3 feet down. Inside were photographs, documents, and a confession letter in Sarah's handwriting, evidence of something so dangerous that people had died to keep it hidden. What had his sweet, quiet wife been running from her entire life? Jake's hands trembled as he lifted the first photograph from the rusted box. The basement's single bare bulb cast harsh shadows across faces he didn't recognize, young people in what looked like 1980s clothing, standing outside this very house. Sarah couldn't have been more than 16, but there she was, unmistakably her delicate features and honey-blonde hair, standing next to a man whose cold eyes made Jake's skin crawl. The man had his arm possessively around Sarah's shoulders, and something about the way she held herself, tense, fearful, sent rage coursing through Jake's veins. On the back of the photo, someone had written in fading ink, "The Prometheus Group, Summer 1987. Diesel whined softly, pressing against Jake's leg as if sensing his master's distress. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears absently, his attention fixed on the documents beneath the photographs. Birth certificates with names that didn't match, social security cards, and what appeared to be records of financial transactions involving astronomical sums of money. But it was Sarah's letter that made his blood run cold. "My dearest Jake," it began in her careful handwriting, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I prayed would stay buried forever. I'm so sorry for the lies, for the secrets, for the danger I may have brought to your doorstep. The woman you married was not who you thought she was." Jake sank onto an overturned milk crate, the letter shaking in his grip. Upstairs, he could hear the autumn wind rattling the windows he'd spent weeks repairing, but down here in the basement's tomb-like silence, only Sarah's words existed. "My real name was Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, and I was part of something terrible. The Prometheus Group wasn't just a pharmaceutical company. We were experimenting on children, Jake, runaways, foster kids, anyone society wouldn't miss. I was young and stupid and scared, and by the time I realized what was happening, I was in too deep to escape." Jake's vision blurred. This couldn't be real. Sarah had been a librarian, for Christ's sake. She'd rescued injured birds and cried during sad movies. She'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. "I helped them dispose of evidence," the letter continued. "Bodies, Jake. Children who didn't survive the experiments. I thought I could expose them, bring them down from the inside, but they found out. 3 people died because of my confession to the FBI. My handler, my contact, and my best friend, Rebecca. They made it look like accidents, but I knew better. That's when I ran." The letter went on to detail how Sarah had assumed a new identity, moved across the country, and built an entirely fabricated life. How she'd met Jake at that dive bar in Phoenix and fallen genuinely in love for the first time in her life. How every day of their marriage had been shadowed by the terror that her past would catch up with them. The letter ended with coordinates and a cryptic reference to the other cache hidden somewhere in the house's framework. Below that, Sarah had drawn a crude map of the basement with an X marked in the corner where Jake now sat. A sudden creak from the floorboards above made both Jake and Diesel freeze. The dog's ears perked up, a low growl building in his throat. Jake quickly stuffed the documents back into the box, his mind racing. He'd been so absorbed in Sarah's revelation that he'd lost track of time. Had someone been watching the house, waiting for him to discover what Sarah had hidden? Another creak, deliberate and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. Jake reached for the .45 he always carried, his other hand gripping Diesel's collar. Whatever Sarah had been running from, it seemed her past had finally come calling. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard as Jake Martinez pulled his Harley into the gravel driveway. The house looked even worse in daylight, peeling paint hanging like dead skin, windows so grimy they might as well have been boarded up. But Sarah had loved this place once, back when she was 8 years old and her grandmother would bake cookies while telling stories about the old country. Thor bounded out of the truck bed before Jake had even killed the engine, immediately investigating a particularly interesting patch of weeds near the front porch. The German Shepherd had been Sarah's dog first, a rescue she'd found limping along Highway 9 3 years ago. Now he was all Jake had left of her, and the damn dog seemed to understand that. Jake grabbed his toolbox and surveyed the damage. The foundation looked solid enough, but everything above ground needed work. Major work. The kind that would take months, maybe a year. Good. He needed the time. Needed something to fill the endless hours that used to belong to Sarah's laughter, her terrible cooking, her habit of stealing his leather jacket because it smelled like motor oil and freedom. "You picked a real winner this time, didn't you, darling?" he muttered, knowing she would have laughed at his sarcasm. The neighbor's screen door slammed shut across the street, and Jake looked up to see a woman in a pink bathrobe retreating inside. Word traveled fast in small towns. By noon, everyone would know the biker had returned to fix up the old Kowalski place. By evening, they'd have theories about why. Jake started with the front steps, prying off rotted boards with a crowbar. The physical work felt good, familiar. His hands knew how to fix things, even if they couldn't fix the hollow ache in his chest. Thor explored the perimeter of the property, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to dig at something that caught his attention. Around 10 o'clock, an old man shuffled over from the house next door. He was thin as a fence post, wearing overalls that had seen better decades. "You Jake?" the man asked, keeping his distance. "That's right. Name's Walter Hendricks. Lived here 43 years. He gestured toward the house with a gnarled hand. "Knew Sarah when she was knee-high to a grasshopper. Sweet kid. Real sorry for your loss." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The unspoken message hung between them like smoke. "We don't want your kind here." Jake had heard it before, in different words, different tones. Sometimes people said it with baseball bats and broken bottles. Walter seemed like the civil type, but the meaning was the same. "Just fixing up my wife's house," Jake said evenly. Nothing more, nothing less. Walter's eyes flicked to the Harley, then to the Hell's Angels patch on Jake's vest. "Uh-huh. Well, like I said, we value our peace and quiet." After Walter left, Jake worked in silence, replacing boards and pulling nails. The rhythm was meditative, almost healing. By afternoon, he'd made real progress on the front porch. Thor had settled into a patch of shade, occasionally lifting his head to track a squirrel or investigate a new scent. Around 4 o'clock, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Jake didn't look up from his work, but he felt the weight of observation, the deliberate pause as the car lingered in front of the house. Message received. He was being watched. The sun was setting when Thor started acting strange. The dog had been calm all day, content to supervise from his shady spot, but suddenly he was alert, ears forward, nose working overtime. He trotted to the far corner of the yard, near an old oak tree that dominated the back fence line. "What is it, boy?" Thor began digging, his powerful claws sending dirt flying. This wasn't his usual casual excavation. This was focused, urgent. Jake walked over, curious despite his exhaustion. "Find something interesting?" The dog looked up at him, dirt on his snout, then returned to digging with renewed intensity. Jake grabbed a shovel from his truck and helped, figuring Thor had found an old bone, or maybe some treasure buried by a long-dead pet. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something hard. Not rock, something with a different density, a hollow sound. Jake knelt and brushed away the loose earth with his hands, Thor panting beside him. It was fabric, old, partially decomposed, but definitely fabric. Jake's chest tightened as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't a pet's hiding spot or some kid's time capsule. Thor whined softly, backing away from the hole as if he suddenly understood what he'd found. Jake stared into the shallow grave, his mind racing. Sarah's childhood home, Sarah's beloved grandmother. Sarah, who never talked about why she'd stopped visiting this place when she turned 12. The morning sun cast long shadows across the torn-up yard as Marcus swung the sledgehammer into what remained of the kitchen wall. Each impact sent vibrations through his shoulders, but the physical pain felt good, cleaner than the ache that had taken residence in his chest. Dust motes danced in the light streaming through the gaping holes where windows used to be. He'd been at it since dawn, methodically tearing down the rotted interior walls Sarah had described in her stories. She'd told him about the narrow galley kitchen where her grandmother had taught her to make pierogies, about the cramped living room where 3 generations had gathered around a television that got 2 channels on a good day. What she hadn't mentioned was the smell. Even after 30 years of abandonment, something lingered in the wood itself, a sour, metallic odor that seemed to intensify as he worked deeper into the house's bones. Marcus had smelled enough blood in his life to recognize it, but this was different, older, mixed with something else he couldn't identify. Kaiser sat in the doorway, his massive head tilted as he watched Marcus work. The German shepherd had been restless since they'd started the demolition, whining at seemingly empty corners and pawing at spots on the floor that looked no different from anywhere else. Now the dog's ears were pinned back, his dark eyes tracking something Marcus couldn't see. "What is it, boy?" Marcus set down the hammer and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather vest. The death's head patch on his chest was coated with plaster dust, making the skull's grin look diseased. Kaiser rose and padded into the gutted kitchen, his nails clicking on the warped linoleum. He stopped at the far corner and began to whine, a low, urgent sound that raised the hair on Marcus's arms. The dog's behavior had been getting stranger each day, but this was different. This was the way Kaiser acted when he sensed real danger. Marcus followed, his boots crunching on debris. The floorboards in this corner sagged more than elsewhere, and when he knelt to examine them, he could see that the supports underneath had partially given way. But it wasn't age that had weakened them. Someone had deliberately cut through the joists, then covered the damage with strips of newer wood that had been painted to match. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, running his fingers along the obvious repair work. Why would someone weaken the floor and then try to hide it? Kaiser's whining grew more insistent. The dog began to dig at the loose linoleum, his claws catching the edge and peeling it back to reveal the subflooring beneath. The wood was stained dark in irregular patterns that definitely weren't water damage. Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket to find a text from Razor. Neighbors called cops again. Noise complaint. Might want to wrap up for today. He glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Kowalski from across the street standing in her garden, but instead of tending her roses, she was staring directly at the house. When their eyes met, she turned away quickly, but not before Marcus caught the expression on her weathered face. It wasn't annoyance or disapproval. It was fear. "Interesting," he said to Kaiser, who had managed to pry up a section of linoleum. The exposed subfloor showed more staining, and now Marcus could identify the second component of that persistent smell: lime. Someone had used lime to cover up the scent of decomposition. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his brother-in-law Danny's number. "What's up?" "Marcus, man, I've been thinking about what you're doing out there." Danny's voice carried that careful tone people used when they thought you might be losing your mind. "Maybe this whole project isn't such a good idea. Since when do you care about home renovation?" "Since I started asking around about that place." "Look, Sarah never talked about her childhood much, right? Maybe there was a reason for that." Marcus watched Kaiser continue to investigate the corner. the dog's entire body tense with focus. What kind of reason? The kind where her family left town in the middle of the night and never came back. The kind where people still cross themselves when they walk past that house. Marcus, whatever Sarah went through there as a kid, she obviously wanted it buried. Maybe. Or maybe she wanted someone to find the truth. What truth? She was 7 when they moved away. What could a 7-year-old possibly know? Marcus ended the call and knelt beside Kaiser. The dog had managed to work a loose floorboard up several inches, revealing the dark space beneath. The smell was stronger now, and definitely coming from whatever lay under the kitchen floor. As he reached for his flashlight, Marcus thought about Sarah's nightmares. She'd had them their entire marriage. Dreams where she was calling for her grandfather, searching through empty rooms while something hunted her. She'd always claimed not to remember the details when she woke up crying. Now, he wondered if she'd been lying about that too. The flashlight beam penetrated the darkness below, and Marcus understood why the neighbors were afraid. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard as Jake positioned himself at the foundation's northwest corner, sledgehammer in hand. The concrete had cracked decades ago, creating a web of fissures that reminded him uncomfortably of broken bones. He'd been putting off this section because it required the most precision. One wrong swing and he'd compromise the entire structural integrity of what he was trying to rebuild. Diesel lay sprawled in his usual spot near the work truck, though Jake noticed the dog's ears twitched at every sound, more alert than his relaxed posture suggested. The German Shepherd had been acting strange since yesterday's discovery of the jewelry box, not aggressive or fearful, but focused in a way that made Jake's skin crawl, like the dog was listening for something Jake couldn't hear. The first swing of the sledgehammer sent vibrations up Jake's arms and loosened a chunk of concrete the size of a dinner plate. Underneath, the dark soil looked different from what he'd been digging through, older, more compact. Sarah had mentioned once that her grandfather had been meticulous about his yard work, constantly moving dirt and replanting. Jake had assumed it was just an old man's hobby. By noon, sweat soaked through his flannel shirt despite the cool October air. He'd cleared almost 3 feet of the old foundation when Diesel suddenly stood, hackles rising. The dog's nose twitched, and he began pacing in tight circles, whining low in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Diesel trotted over to where Jake had been working and began pawing at the exposed earth, his claws scraping against something that definitely wasn't soil. Jake knelt beside him and brushed away loose dirt with his hands. His fingers encountered fabric, old, partially decomposed but unmistakably clothing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed the small hand spade from his tool belt. Working carefully, he scraped away more earth, revealing what looked like a child's shirt, faded blue with traces of a pattern that might once have been cartoon characters. The fabric fell apart at his touch, crumbling like old paper. Jake sat back on his heels, mind racing. Sarah had never mentioned any pets being buried on the property, and this looked too large for a pet anyway. The rational part of his brain suggested calling the police immediately, but another part, the part that had learned to be suspicious of authority through years in the club, whispered warnings about inviting that kind of scrutiny. Diesel whined again, more insistently, and Jake realized the dog was staring at something else. Following his gaze, Jake spotted what looked like a small piece of white plastic poking through the dirt about 2 feet away. He crawled over and carefully excavated around it, revealing a child's toy, a small plastic horse, the kind that came with those miniature farm sets. One leg was broken off, and dirt had settled into the molded details of the mane and saddle. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Children's clothing, children's toys, buried in the yard of the house where Sarah had grown up. Jake's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and scrolled to Sarah's sister Monica's number. They'd barely spoken since the funeral. Monica had made it clear she thought Sarah could have done better than a biker, but she was the only family member who might have answers about the property's history. "Jake?" Monica's voice was surprised, cautious. "Is everything okay? I need to ask you something about Sarah's grandfather, about the old house." A pause. What kind of something? Did any kids ever go missing in the neighborhood? Back when Sarah was little? The silence stretched so long Jake thought the call had dropped. When Monica finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why are you asking me that? Monica, I need you to tell me if you know anything. Anything at all. Jake, you need to stop whatever you're doing and leave that place alone." The fear in her voice was unmistakable now. "What aren't you telling me?" "No what?" "Monica, what the hell are you talking about?" "The Hendricks boy. Tommy Hendricks. He disappeared in 1987 when Sarah was 8. The police searched everywhere, questioned everyone in the neighborhood. They even searched Grandpa's yard, but..." She took a shuddering breath. "But they never found anything." Jake's blood turned to ice water. "What happened to him?" "Nobody knows. The case went cold. But Sarah always wondered. She said Grandpa acted different after that summer. Paranoid. Started spending hours working in the yard, moving dirt around. She thought maybe what? Maybe Grandpa knew more than he told the police." The morning fog clung to the valley like a shroud as Jake bent over the hole Diesel had excavated. What he'd initially dismissed as his dog's obsession with a particular scent now demanded his full attention. The German shepherd sat at attention beside him, ears perked, watching his master's every move with an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Jake. The fabric Diesel had unearthed wasn't just any cloth. It was a child's dress, faded pink with tiny white flowers. Jake's hands trembled as he lifted it from the dark earth. The material felt fragile, as if it might disintegrate at his touch, but it was unmistakably real. His mind raced back to the photograph he'd found of Sarah as a little girl, wearing what looked like this exact dress. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, setting the garment carefully on a clean tarp. Diesel whined softly, nudging Jake's arm before returning his attention to the hole. The dog's behavior suggested there was more down there. Jake grabbed his shovel with renewed purpose, but this time he dug with archaeological precision rather than the aggressive determination he'd shown while demolishing walls. Each scoop revealed more of what appeared to be a deliberately buried cache. A small leather shoe emerged next, followed by what looked like a journal wrapped in plastic. The journal's pages had survived better than expected. Sarah's childish handwriting filled the first several entries, innocent observations about butterflies and her favorite hiding spots around the property. But as Jake flipped through the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. The innocent musings gave way to increasingly disturbed accounts that made his blood run cold. "And Daddy says I can't tell anyone about our special games. He says they wouldn't understand how much he loves me." Jake's vision blurred. He forced himself to continue reading, though every instinct screamed at him to stop. "I buried my favorite dress today. I don't want to wear it anymore because it reminds me of the bad touching. Maybe if I bury it deep enough, the memories will stay buried too." The journal slipped from Jake's hands as the full horror of Sarah's childhood crashed over him. She'd never spoken about her father beyond mentioning that he'd died when she was young. Now Jake understood why. The man hadn't just died. He'd been a monster who'd robbed his daughter of her innocence and left scars that Sarah had carried in silence until her own death. Diesel barked sharply, drawing Jake's attention back to the present. The dog was focused on something beyond the property line, his body rigid with alert tension. Jake followed his gaze and spotted a figure partially concealed behind the tree line. Someone had been watching him. The observer stepped forward, no longer bothering with concealment. It was Earl Hendricks, the neighbor who'd been most vocal about Jake's presence in the area. But the man's usual sneer had been replaced by something that looked like fear. "You need to stop digging," Earl called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. Jake stood slowly, the journal clutched in his fist. "Why? What are you afraid I'll find?" Earl's face went pale. "Some things are better left buried, biker. Your wife understood that. My wife was a child when she lived here, a child who was being abused by her own father." Jake's voice carried the promise of violence. "Did you know about that, Earl?" The older man's composure cracked. "We all suspected something wasn't right in that house. But back then, people minded their own business. What happened between a man and his family, Was none of your concern? Jake's hand moved instinctively to the knife on his belt. A little girl was being tortured, and you all just looked the other way. It wasn't that simple. Earl's voice rose defensively. Frank Brennan was a dangerous man. Cross him and bad things happened to people. Ask around about the Peterson boy who went missing after he started asking too many questions. Diesel growled low in his throat, sensing his master's rising fury. The dog's attention remained fixed on Earl, as if recognizing a threat that needed to be neutralized. Where is Frank Brennan buried? Jake's question carried the weight of judgment. Earl backed away, suddenly aware that he might have said too much. He died of natural causes, heart attack, been in the ground for over 20 years. That's not what I asked. Jake took a step forward, and Earl retreated further. The old cemetery on Mill Road. But you leave this alone, you hear me? Some secrets died with Frank, and they need to stay dead. Earl turned and hurried away, but Jake barely noticed his departure. His attention had returned to the hole at his feet, where Diesel was pawing at something else buried in the dark earth, something that glinted metallic in the pale morning light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the torn-up yard as Jake knelt beside the hole, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he brushed more dirt away from the fabric. Rex sat motionless nearby, his intelligent eyes fixed on his master's face, reading every micro-expression with the acute sensitivity of a dog who'd learned to navigate human grief. The fabric was definitely clothing, a child's dress, pale blue with tiny white flowers. Jake's stomach clenched as he recognized the pattern. Sarah had kept a photo of herself as a little girl wearing this exact dress, standing in front of the very house he was now rebuilding. She'd shown it to him once, years ago, during one of their rare conversations about her childhood. "I was so proud of that dress," she'd whispered, her voice carrying an odd mixture of joy and pain. "Mama saved for months to buy it for me." Now, here it was, buried in what should have been an empty yard, wrapped around something that Jake's mind refused to fully process. The small bones were unmistakably human, unmistakably young. His hands moved of their own accord, clearing more earth with the gentle precision of someone who understood that what lay before him demanded reverence, not haste. Rex whined softly, a sound Jake had never heard from him before, low, mournful, almost human in its grief. The dog's nose twitched, and Jake realized with sick certainty that Rex had known something was wrong with this spot long before his shovel had broken through. "What the hell are you doing over there, freak?" The voice made Jake's blood freeze. Tommy Henley stood at the edge of the property, his usual sneer faltering as he took in the scene. Behind him, 2 other neighbors had gathered, drawn by some morbid curiosity that Jake couldn't fathom. "Get lost, Henley." Jake's voice came out as a growl, his protective instincts kicking in even as his mind reeled. Whatever this was, whoever this had been, they deserved better than to become neighborhood gossip. But Tommy was already moving closer, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the excavation. "Jesus Christ, is that—" "I said get lost!" Jake rose slowly, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. Rex stood as well, positioning himself between the grave and the intruders, a low rumble building in his chest. Tommy stumbled backward, but his eyes remained fixed on the hole. "You buried a kid in your yard? You sick bastard. I'm calling the cops right now." "It's not—" Jake started, then stopped. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? How could he tell them that this grave was old, older than his time here, older than his marriage to Sarah? The dress alone proved that much. "Just stay back while I figure this out." But Tommy was already pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. Jake could hear him speaking rapidly to the dispatcher, his voice high with excitement and revulsion. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens began to pierce the morning quiet. Jake knelt again beside the grave, his mind racing. Sarah had grown up in this house. This dress had been hers, but the bones, they couldn't be hers. Sarah had lived, had grown up, had become the woman he'd loved and lost, so whose child lay buried beneath the foundation of her childhood home. Rex pressed against his leg, offering what comfort he could. Jake's hand found the dog's head, drawing strength from the familiar warmth. Together, they waited as the sirens grew louder, as neighbors began to emerge from their houses like vultures drawn to carrion. Detective Maria Santos arrived within the hour, her practiced eyes taking in the scene with professional detachment. Jake had dealt with cops before, too many times given his association with the angels, but Santos seemed different. She looked at the grave with respect rather than sensationalism, and when she spoke to Jake, her voice carried none of the judgment he'd expected. "Rex did," Jake replied, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "He wouldn't stop digging." Santos nodded, making notes. "We'll need to process the scene. I'm going to have to ask you to step back while the crime scene team does their work." Crime scene? The words felt foreign in Jake's mouth. "Any unexplained death is treated as a potential homicide until we know otherwise," Santos explained gently, "especially when it involves a child." As the yard filled with investigators and equipment, Jake found himself standing at the edge of his property, watching strangers catalogue what might be the darkest secret of Sarah's past. The neighbors maintained their distance now, their earlier mockery replaced by a nervous tension that seemed to electrify the air. Rex remained pressed against his leg, and Jake realized that his faithful companion had just unearthed more than old bones. Whatever Sarah had kept hidden about her childhood was about to come to light, and something told him that some people would do anything to keep it buried. The morning after finding the second bone, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee growing cold between his hands. Thor lay at his feet, unusually still, as if the dog sensed the weight pressing down on the house. Through the window, Marcus could see Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitching. She'd been watching since dawn. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over Sarah's journals. The entries he'd read painted a picture of a childhood far darker than anything she'd ever shared with him. References to Uncle Dale's special games and her mother's long absences made his stomach turn. But it was the final entry that haunted him most. "I told Mama what Uncle Dale did, but she said I was lying. She said if I told anyone else, something bad would happen. I won't tell. I promise I won't tell." The sound of gravel crunching in his driveway pulled Marcus from his thoughts. Through the window, he watched Detective Rivera step out of an unmarked sedan, a partner close behind. Thor's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Marcus opened the door before Rivera could knock. "Detective." "Mr. Stone, we need to talk." Her expression was grim. "The bones your dog found, our forensic team has some preliminary findings." Marcus stepped aside, letting them enter. Rivera's partner, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, pulled out a small notebook. "Detective Walsh," Rivera said by way of introduction. "He's our specialist in cold cases involving children." The word children hit Marcus like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, Thor immediately pressing against his leg. Walsh flipped through his notes. The bones belonged to a child, approximately 8 to 10 years old. Based on the depth they were buried and some items found with the remains, we're looking at a time frame of roughly 30 to 40 years ago. Marcus's throat felt dry. "Items?" "A small silver bracelet with the name Jenny engraved on it," Rivera said, watching his face carefully. "Does that name mean anything to you?" He shook his head, but something nagged at him. Sarah had mentioned a childhood friend once, someone who'd moved away suddenly. He couldn't remember the name. "We're going to need to expand the search," Walsh continued. "If your dog found remains that easily, there might be more. We'll have a full forensics team here by noon." "How long will this take?" Marcus asked. "As long as it takes," Rivera replied. "This is now an active homicide investigation. We'll also need you to stay available for questioning. And, Mr. Stone, I strongly suggest you don't do any more digging until we're finished." After the detectives left, Marcus found himself alone with Thor and the growing certainty that his wife's past held secrets that could destroy everything he thought he knew about her. He walked to the spare bedroom where he'd stored Sarah's belongings and pulled out a small photo album he'd barely glanced at before. The pictures showed a young Sarah, gap-toothed and smiling, but as Marcus looked closer, he noticed how the smiles became more forced as the photos progressed. In several images, a man stood behind Sarah and an older woman who must have been her mother. The man's hands rested on Sarah's shoulders, and something about his smile made Marcus's skin crawl. A loose photograph fell from between the pages. Two young girls, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. Sarah and another girl with dark pigtails. On the back, in child's handwriting, "Me and Jenny, best friends forever." Marcus stared at the photo until his hands began to shake. Jenny, the name on the bracelet, Sarah's best friend who had supposedly moved away. The sound of vehicles arriving broke through his concentration. Through the window, he watched a parade of official cars and vans pull up to his property. Uniformed officers began setting up a perimeter while technicians unloaded equipment. Mrs. Henderson had abandoned all pretense of subtlety and stood openly in her yard, phone pressed to her ear. Rivera approached the house again, this time wearing latex gloves and carrying a clipboard. "We're going to start with ground-penetrating radar," she called out. "Map the entire property before we dig." Marcus nodded and retreated inside, but Thor refused to leave his post by the window. The dog's attention was fixed on something in the distance, not the investigators but the old oak tree where he'd found the first bone. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus watched the systematic destruction of his renovation project. The neat piles of lumber he'd arranged were moved aside. His carefully planned garden beds were marked with flags and tape. The life he'd been trying to build was being dismantled piece by piece. But it was the phone call that came just after sunset that shattered what remained of his composure. "Mr. Stone?" Rivera's voice was tight. "We found something else. You need to come outside." Marcus stepped onto his porch to find Rivera illuminated by portable floodlights, her face pale despite the harsh glare. "We found more remains," she said quietly. "A lot more." The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Jake's trailer as he sat hunched over the kitchen table, staring at the collection of items Sarah's journal had led him to find. The brass key, the photograph of Sarah with the unknown man, and a small velvet pouch containing what appeared to be uncut diamonds. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Rex lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his massive head to study his master's face with those intelligent dark eyes. The dog seemed to sense the weight of what they'd uncovered, remaining unusually still and watchful. Jake's phone buzzed against the scarred wood of the table. "Marcus, you sound like hell," his brother's voice crackled through the speaker when Jake answered. "Didn't sleep much." Jake rubbed his stubbled jaw, feeling every one of his 43 years. "Found some things last night. About Sarah." A pause. "What kind of things?" Jake looked at the photograph again, studying the way Sarah leaned into the stranger, her smile genuine and unguarded in a way he'd rarely seen during their marriage. The kind that make you realize you never really knew someone. "You want company? I can ride out there." "Not yet. I need to figure some things out first." After hanging up, Jake walked to the window overlooking the construction site. The foundation work was nearly complete, but seeing it now filled him with an odd sense of dread rather than accomplishment. Every board he'd laid, every nail he'd driven, had been in service of honoring Sarah's memory. But what if that memory was built on lies? He pocketed the key and photograph, leaving the diamonds hidden in his bedroom safe. Rex perked up as Jake grabbed his jacket, tail beginning its familiar rhythm against the floor. "Come on, boy. Time to do some digging that doesn't involve your nose." The Millbrook Public Library occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, its Gothic revival architecture making it look more like a haunted house than a repository of knowledge. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, remembered Sarah Richardson and was happy to help Jake access the newspaper archives. "Such a tragedy when she left town," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she led Jake to a computer terminal in the basement. Her family had been here for generations. The Richardsons were one of Millbrook's founding families, you know. Jake didn't know. Sarah had always been vague about her family history, claiming it was too painful to discuss after losing her parents. The microfilm machine hummed to life as Jake scrolled through editions of the Millbrook Gazette from 15 years ago, around the time Sarah would have left town. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found it. The headline made his blood run cold: "Local businessman found dead in apparent suicide." But it was the next paragraph that made Jake's hands shake. Police sources indicate Hartwell had been under investigation for embezzlement of town development funds. An estimated $2.3 million remains unaccounted for. Jake printed the article and continued searching. 3 days later, another story caught his attention. Richardson family leaves Millbrook after decades. The brief piece mentioned that Robert and Margaret Richardson had sold their property and relocated out of state with their daughter Sarah, citing personal reasons for the sudden departure. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Hartwell dies under suspicious circumstances, millions go missing, and Sarah's family flees town within a week. The brass key felt heavy in his pocket as Jake considered its significance. Safe deposit box? Storage unit? Mrs. Chen appeared at his shoulder. "Finding what you need, dear." "Mrs. Chen, do you remember anything about Thomas Hartwell's death? Any rumors or unofficial details?" The old woman's expression grew cautious. "That was a difficult time for our community. Thomas was well respected, but..." She glanced around the empty basement before continuing in a whisper. There were whispers that he didn't act alone, that someone else was involved in the missing money. "Any idea who?" "Nothing concrete. But I remember thinking it strange how quickly the Richardson family left, especially Sarah. She and Thomas had been seen together quite frequently in the months before his death. Some people wondered if there was more to their relationship than business." Jake's stomach clenched. "Business?" "Oh yes. Sarah worked part-time at his development company during her senior year of high school and after graduation. Bright girl, very good with numbers and computers." As Jake drove back to the property, Rex panting in the passenger seat, pieces of a disturbing puzzle began forming in his mind. Sarah hadn't just known Thomas Hartwell. She'd worked for him, possibly loved him, and quite possibly helped him steal over $2 million. The question now was whether that money was still hidden somewhere, and if Sarah's decision to rebuild her childhood home was really about honoring the past or recovering buried treasure. The construction site looked different now, less like a labor of love and more like an elaborate excavation project. The sheriff's department arrived at dawn, their vehicles creating a small convoy that stretched down Maple Street. Jake stood on his porch, watching deputies string yellow tape around his property, while neighbors gathered in clusters, their morning coffee growing cold as they whispered among themselves. Detective Maria Santos approached, her weathered face serious beneath graying hair. She'd been working cases in this county for 20 years, and Jake could see in her eyes that she'd rarely encountered something like this. "Mr. Morrison, we're going to need you to stay clear of the backyard while our team processes the scene," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "How long has your dog been digging back there?" "Started about a week ago," Jake replied, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Thor's never been much of a digger. That's why I thought it was strange." Santos nodded, making notes in a small pad. "And you said this was your wife's childhood home?" "Sarah inherited it from her grandmother. We'd planned to fix it up together, but..." Jake's voice trailed off. Even after 8 months, talking about Sarah felt like swallowing glass. "I'm sorry for your loss," Santos said genuinely. "How much did your wife tell you about growing up here?" The question hit Jake oddly. He'd been thinking about that very thing since Thor's discovery. "Not much, actually. She always said it was a boring small town, nothing worth talking about, said she couldn't wait to leave." Santos scribbled something else. "We'll need to speak with some of the longtime residents, get a sense of the neighborhood's history." From across the street, Jake noticed Mrs. Chen watching intently. The elderly woman had lived on Maple Street longer than anyone, and he'd seen her having hushed conversations with other neighbors whenever they thought he wasn't looking. There was something in their expressions, Not just curiosity about the bones, but recognition, as if they knew something they weren't saying. Dr. Elizabeth Hayward, the forensic anthropologist, emerged from the backyard with dirt-stained gloves and a grim expression. She approached Santos with the careful walk of someone who'd spent hours crouched over delicate work. Initial assessment suggests we're looking at remains that have been in the ground for 15 to 20 years, she reported quietly. Adult male, based on the pelvic structure. Trauma to the skull indicates this wasn't a natural death. Jake felt his stomach drop. 20 years ago, Sarah would have been in high school. She'd never mentioned anything unusual from that time. No disappearances, no local tragedies. She'd painted her teenage years as mundane, filled with the typical struggles of a girl desperate to escape small-town life. "Any idea on identity?" Santos asked. "Too early to tell. We'll need dental records, missing person reports from that time period." Dr. Hayward glanced toward Jake. "Has anyone in the family mentioned missing persons from back then?" "Sarah's grandmother died 5 years ago," Jake said. "And Sarah never talked about the old days here. I got the impression she didn't have many friends growing up." Thor whined from inside the house, scratching at the back door. The German shepherd had been agitated all morning, pacing and whining as strangers tramped through what he clearly considered his territory. Jake wondered if the dog could sense something the humans couldn't, some lingering presence or energy that clung to the discovery site. "There's something else," Dr. Hayward said, lowering her voice. "The way the remains were buried, it was careful, deliberate. Someone took time to dig deep, to hide this properly. This wasn't a panic burial." The implication hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't a crime of passion hastily covered up. Someone had planned this, had known exactly what they were doing. As the morning wore on, more neighbors emerged. Jake noticed how they clustered together, speaking in low voices while casting glances toward his property. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down kept wringing her hands, her face pale. Old Mr. Rodriguez wouldn't meet Jake's eyes at all. Detective Santos noticed it too. "Tight-knit community," she observed. "Yeah, maybe too tight," Jake muttered. The feeling that everyone knew something he didn't was growing stronger by the hour. These people had watched him work on the house for weeks, had seen Thor digging, and not one of them had offered a word of warning or insight. Sarah's face smiled at him from the wedding photo on his phone's lock screen. Radiant, laughing, beautiful. Looking at it now, Jake wondered what secrets had hidden behind that smile. What had his wife known about the darkness buried in her childhood backyard? And, more troubling still, had she known it was there all along? The skeletal remains belonged to a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The small skull showed signs of blunt force trauma that made Marcus's stomach turn. But it was what he'd found wrapped in rotting canvas nearby that had kept him awake for 2 straight nights, a leather journal. Its pages brittle but still legible, filled with Sarah's childish handwriting. "Daddy says I can't tell anyone about Emma. He says she was a bad girl who tried to run away, and that's why she had to be punished. But Emma wasn't bad. She was my friend, and she was scared all the time, just like me." Marcus set the journal aside, his hands trembling as he reached for the bottle of whiskey he'd brought down. The amber liquid burned, but not enough to wash away the images forming in his mind. Sarah's father, the man she'd rarely spoken of except in hushed, frightened tones, the reason she'd moved across the country as soon as she turned 18, the nightmares that used to wake her screaming about dark places underground. Kaiser whined from his position at the basement stairs, refusing to come closer to the excavation site. Even the dog sensed something unholy about this place. The creak of floorboards above made Marcus freeze. He'd been so absorbed in his grim archaeology that he hadn't heard anyone approach the house. Heavy footsteps moved across the living room, deliberate and searching. Marcus reached for the .45 he'd started carrying since finding the bones, his military training kicking in as he positioned himself behind the basement support beam. Marcus Thorne. The voice that drifted down was smooth, cultured, nothing like the rough biker associates who occasionally visited. "We need to talk," Then talk, Marcus called back, keeping his weapon ready. But stay where you are. A low chuckle echoed through the house. I think you'll want to hear this face to face. It's about Sarah, about what really happened in this house. Against every instinct, Marcus found himself climbing the stairs. Kaiser pressed close to his legs, hackles raised. In the living room stood a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a grey suit that probably cost more than Marcus's Harley. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his smile predatory. Detective Raymond Marsh, retired, the man said, extending a hand that Marcus ignored. I worked Sarah's case back in '92. Her disappearance, that is. Sarah didn't disappear. She moved to California. That's the story, yes. Marsh moved to the window, gazing out at the concerned faces of neighbors who'd gathered across the street. But there were complications, things that needed to be cleaned up before a traumatized little girl could start her new life. Marcus felt the world tilt. What kind of complications? The kind that involved her father's business associates, men who didn't appreciate loose ends. Marsh turned back, his eyes cold as winter steel. You see, Harold Brennan wasn't just an abusive drunk, he was a facilitator, provided certain services to certain people, services that required absolute discretion. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The basement, the bones, Sarah's terror of confined spaces, her inability to be around children without breaking down. She witnessed things, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. She did more than witness. Sarah was supposed to be the star attraction at one of dear old Dad's parties. But she was clever, that girl. Hid when the men came, watched from the heating vent as they concluded their business with little Emma downstairs. Marcus's vision blurred red. You son of a bitch. And now that she's dead? Now there's you, digging up the past. Literally. Marsh's smile never wavered. My former associates are very concerned about what you might find, what you might do with that information. Marcus raised his gun. Get out! I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore. You've opened Pandora's box, Mr. Thorne. And some secrets have a way of burying themselves, along with anyone who uncovers them. The sound of vehicles approaching made both men look toward the window. Black SUVs were pulling up outside, their occupants already moving with military precision toward the house. Marsh checked his watch. Right on time. The Sheriff's Department crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze like yellow prayer flags around Sarah's childhood home. Jake sat on his Harley in the driveway, watching the last of the forensics team pack their equipment into white vans. 3 days had passed since Thor's discovery, and the world had tilted sideways. Detective Morrison approached, her badge catching the porch light Jake had finally gotten working. We've got preliminary results, she said, pulling out a small notebook. The remains are approximately 15 years old, female, late teens to early 20s. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Jake's hands tightened on his helmet. 15 years ago, Sarah would have been 19, the same age as the victim. There's more, Morrison continued. We found fabric remnants, high-end clothing, probably designer, and this. She held up an evidence bag containing a tarnished silver bracelet. Custom made. We're tracking down the jeweler. The bracelet meant nothing to Jake, but something cold settled in his stomach anyway. He'd thought he knew everything about Sarah, but the house was teaching him otherwise. Each renovation had revealed another layer of secrets, hidden rooms, false walls, and now this. Any idea who she might be? He asked. Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. We're checking missing persons reports from that time period. But Jake, I need to ask, did Sarah ever mention knowing anyone who disappeared? Maybe a friend who just vanished? Before Jake could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I'd stop digging or join her. He showed Morrison the message. Her face hardened as she called for the tech team to return. While they worked on tracing the number, Jake found himself staring at the excavation site. The hole gaped like a wound in Sarah's mother's garden, the place where prize-winning roses once bloomed. Thor paced restlessly beside him, ears pricked forward. The dog had been agitated since the discovery, as if he sensed that unearthing one secret had awakened others. Jake trusted that instinct. In his years with the angels, he'd learned to read the signs when danger circled closer. Neighbor curtains twitched in windows up and down the street. The mocking laughter had stopped, replaced by nervous whispers and suspicious glances. Mrs. Kowalski from next door had taken to checking her locks twice each night. The Hendersons had installed a security system. Fear had a way of spreading through suburbia like wildfire. Morrison finished with the tech team and returned. "Jake, I need you to be straight with me. Is there anything about Sarah's past that might connect to this? Anything at all?" He wanted to say no, wanted to protect Sarah's memory the same way he'd protected her in life. But the dead girl in the garden deserved justice, and the text message suggested the killer was still out there. Sarah never talked much about high school, he admitted. Said it was a dark time. Her parents were going through a messy divorce, and she felt caught in the middle. But she never mentioned any friends disappearing. What about after you two got together? Any strange calls, unexpected visitors, anyone from her past trying to reconnect? Jake thought back through their years together. Sarah had been friendly but never close to anyone. She'd claimed she preferred keeping their circle small, just the two of them against the world. Now he wondered if there had been another reason for her isolation. "There was something," he said slowly. "About 6 months before the cancer diagnosis, Sarah started having nightmares, really bad ones. She'd wake up screaming, but she could never remember what they were about, or said she couldn't." Morrison made notes. "Did she seek treatment? Talk to anyone about them?" "I tried to get her to see someone, but she refused, said it was just stress from her mother's death." Jake paused, remembering. "But now that I think about it, the nightmare started right after we decided to inherit this place. When we first talked about fixing it up." The detective looked up sharply. "She knew you'd be renovating, digging up the yard?" The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If Sarah had known about the body, if she'd been protecting that secret all these years, then her reluctance to return home made terrible sense. So did her insistence that they sell the property instead of renovating. Morrison's radio crackled with an incoming call. She stepped away to answer, leaving Jake alone with his spiraling thoughts. When she returned, her expression was grim. "The bracelet just got identified. Custom piece made by a jeweler in the city 15 years ago. Purchased for someone named Rebecca Martinez. Her parents reported her missing in June of that year. She was 19, college student, last seen leaving a house party." Morrison met Jake's eyes. The party was 3 blocks from here. Sarah's address was in Rebecca's contact list. Thor growled low in his throat, hackles rising as headlights swept across the yard. A dark sedan cruised slowly past, windows tinted, license plate obscured by mud. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the knife on his belt. The message had been clear: stop digging or join her. But Jake had never backed down from a threat in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. The photograph trembled in Marcus's weathered hands as he stared at the faces arranged in neat rows. 23 children, all wearing identical blue uniforms, their eyes vacant in a way that made his stomach churn. Sarah sat in the front row, third from the left, maybe 8 years old. Her dark hair was cropped short, almost boyish, and that spark he'd fallen in love with was nowhere to be seen. "Brightwood Academy for Troubled Youth," he read aloud from the faded inscription at the bottom. The name meant nothing to him, but Kaiser whined softly from his position by the window, as if sensing the darkness radiating from the yellowed paper. Marcus set the photo aside and reached for the manila folder underneath. The contents spilled across the coffee table like autumn leaves. Medical records, incident reports, and correspondence bearing official letterheads. His hands moved mechanically, sorting through documents that painted a picture of his wife he'd never known existed. Subject exhibits signs of severe trauma following extended isolation therapy. Recommend continued observation in the rehabilitation wing. Patient 23S remains unresponsive to standard conditioning methods. A loose sheet caught his attention. A hand-drawn map in a child's careful script. The paper was worn soft from folding and unfolding, and Sarah's name was written in the corner in faded pencil. It showed the layout of what appeared to be a large building, with rooms marked as dormitories, a kitchen, offices, and something labelled the quiet room that was circled multiple times in red crayon. Marcus's phone buzzed against the table. Detective Chen's name flashed on the screen. "We found something," Chen said without preamble when Marcus answered. "The bones your dog uncovered? They're not just human remains. They're children, Marcus. At least 4 of them, all between the ages of 8 and 12 based on preliminary examination." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white against the wood. "How long have they been there?" "Coroner estimates 20 to 25 years. But here's the thing. We ran the dental records through missing persons databases. 2 of the victims have been identified. Both were reported as runaways from something called Brightwood Academy." The folder in front of Marcus suddenly felt radioactive. "I need to show you something." Marcus's vision blurred as the pieces clicked into place. Sarah had never talked about her childhood, deflecting his questions with jokes or changing the subject entirely. He'd assumed it was just a painful divorce or family dysfunction, the kind of everyday trauma that people preferred to leave buried. He'd never imagined anything like this. "The academy was investigated multiple times," Chen was saying. "Reports of physical abuse, psychological torture, children disappearing and being written off as runaways. But Blackwood had connections, money, and the whole thing got swept under the rug until a state inspector found evidence of what they called extreme disciplinary measures." "Is he still alive?" Marcus's voice came out as a growl. "That's what we're trying to determine. He disappeared right before the academy closed down, liquidated his assets and vanished. But someone buried those children on that property after the academy shut down. Someone who knew about the place, knew it would be abandoned." Marcus stared at the child's map spread before him, at the room circled in red crayon. Sarah had drawn this while trapped in that place, probably planning an escape she'd never managed to execute. She'd survived something that had killed other children, and she'd carried that secret for her entire adult life. Kaiser's sudden bark made him look up. Through the window, he could see a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine running. The driver's face was obscured by shadow, but something about the car's positioning felt deliberate, predatory. "Chen," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I think someone's watching my house. Get away from the windows. We're sending units now." Whatever Sarah had discovered about her past, whatever had driven her to dig up that yard, it had cost her life. And now Marcus was walking the same dangerous path. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, jolting Marcus from a restless sleep on Sarah's childhood bed. The caller ID showed Detective Rivera's number, and Marcus knew immediately that whatever news awaited him wouldn't be good. "We found him," Rivera said without preamble. "Thomas Brennan. He's been dead for 6 hours." Marcus sat up, his mind instantly sharp despite the early hour. "Where?" "Motel off Highway 9, about 20 miles south of town. Single gunshot to the head, execution style, professional work." Rivera paused. "There's something else. We found a burner phone in his room. Last call was to a number registered to someone named Vincent Corelli." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd heard it whispered in certain circles, always with a mixture of fear and respect. Vincent Corelli wasn't just connected to organized crime, he was a cornerstone of it, a man who built empires on violence and silence. "Marcus, you still there?" "Yeah." His voice came out rough. "What's the connection?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. But given what Brennan told us about Sarah's past, about the money and the witness protection—" Rivera's voice trailed off meaningfully. Marcus understood. If Sarah had been connected to Corelli's operation, if she'd taken something that belonged to him, then her death might not have been the random tragedy everyone assumed. And now, 15 years later, that past had finally caught up. After hanging up, Marcus couldn't return to sleep. He walked through the house, Rex padding silently beside him, both of them alert to shadows that seemed to shift and move in ways that defied the moonlight streaming through the windows. The renovations he'd completed felt suddenly hollow, as if he'd been building a monument to a woman who might never have existed. In Sarah's old bedroom, he pulled out the photo albums he'd found, studying her young face for any hint of the secret she'd carried. The girl in the pictures looked innocent, carefree, but Marcus had learned enough about deception to know that appearances meant nothing. How many times had he looked into her eyes during their marriage, never suspecting the weight of whatever she was hiding? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or join your wife." Marcus stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. He'd lived with violence too long to be easily intimidated. It was anger, pure and righteous, at the realization that Sarah's death might not have been natural causes at all. The heart attack that claimed her at 38 had seemed sudden but not impossible. Now he wondered if someone had helped it along. Rex growled low, his ears pricked toward the front of the house. Marcus pocketed his phone and moved to the window, peering through the curtains. A dark sedan sat across the street, engine running, exhaust visible in the cool night air. As he watched, the passenger window rolled down slightly, and the red ember of a cigarette glowed in the darkness. They weren't hiding anymore. The message was clear. They knew where he was, and they wanted him to know it. Marcus checked his. 45, ensuring a round was chambered. Whatever game had begun 15 years ago was reaching its endgame now, and he refused to be a passive player. Sarah might have run from these people, might have hidden and hoped the past would stay buried, but Marcus wasn't built that way. He'd never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were stacked against him. The sedan's engine revved once, a sound that carried clearly in the quiet neighborhood. Then the vehicle pulled away, taillights disappearing around the corner. But Marcus knew they'd be back. Men like Corelli didn't make threats they weren't prepared to follow through on. He spent the remaining hours until dawn preparing. He cleaned his weapons, checked his ammunition, and called 3 numbers. Brothers from the club who would come, without questions, if he needed them. The house that had once been his sanctuary was now a potential trap, but it was also his chosen battleground. If they wanted him, they could come and get him. As the first light of morning crept through the windows, Marcus stood in the living room where Rex had first discovered the hidden safe. The hole in the wall had been repaired, the evidence of Sarah's secrets plastered over and painted, but the knowledge remained. She'd been someone else before she became his wife, someone who'd crossed dangerous people and paid for it with a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. Now that burden was his, and he'd carry it the only way he knew how, straight ahead, no matter what waited in the darkness. The neighbors who'd mocked his renovation efforts would soon understand that some projects were about more than restoring old houses. Sometimes they were about bringing buried truths into the light, regardless of the cost. The sheriff's department had cordoned off the backyard with yellow tape that fluttered in the morning breeze like prayer flags. Jake stood at his kitchen window, watching crime scene technicians methodically excavate the area where Bruno had made his grisly discovery. Each shovelful of earth revealed more of what had been hidden for decades. Detective Martinez approached the house, her expression grim. Jake met her at the back door before she could knock. "We've recovered 3 bodies so far," she said without preamble. 2 adults, 1 child. All showing signs of trauma consistent with violent death. Jake's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "How long they been down there?" "Preliminary estimates suggest 20 to 30 years. We're bringing in a forensic anthropologist from the State University." Martinez studied his face. "Mr. Reeves, I need to ask you again, did your wife ever mention anything about her childhood here? Anything at all that might help us understand what happened?" "Nothing." The word came out harsher than he intended. "Sarah never talked about growing up here. Said it was too painful after her parents died." "About that." Martinez consulted her notepad. "We've been digging into the property records. Sarah's parents didn't die in a car accident like she told you. They disappeared in 1994. No bodies were ever found." The case went cold. The cigarette fell from Jake's fingers. "That's impossible." "I'm sorry. I know this is difficult. Martinez's voice softened slightly. We're going to need to search the house too. There might be evidence that could help identify the victims or explain what happened here. Jake nodded numbly. Through the window he watched Bruno lying in the shade of the oak tree, the dog's usual energy dampened by the chaos surrounding his home. The German shepherd had barely eaten since yesterday, as if he understood the gravity of what he'd uncovered. There's something else, Martinez continued. We found personal effects with the bodies. A wallet belonging to David Chen, reported missing in 1993, a bracelet belonging to Linda Morrison, missing since 1995, and a child's backpack with the name Tommy Chen written inside. Mr. Reeves, we have to consider the possibility that Sarah knew about these deaths, maybe even witnessed them. No. Jake's voice was steel. My wife wasn't a killer. I'm not saying she was, but someone buried those bodies in her backyard, someone with access to this property over a period of years. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If Sarah had known about the murders, if she'd lived with that secret their entire marriage, what did that say about everything he thought he knew about her? About their life together? A commotion in the backyard drew their attention. One of the technicians was calling Martinez over urgently. She excused herself and hurried outside, leaving Jake alone with his spiraling thoughts. He wandered into the living room, where Sarah's childhood photographs still sat on the mantel. In every picture, she looked happy, a bright-eyed girl with pigtails and gap-toothed smiles. But now Jake found himself studying the backgrounds, looking for clues he'd missed before. In one photo, a man stood partially visible at the edge of the frame, his face turned away from the camera. In another, what looked like fresh earth was visible through a window. Bruno appeared at the sliding door, whimpering softly. Jake let him in, and the dog immediately went to Sarah's favorite armchair, circling it twice before settling on the floor beside it with a heavy sigh. I know, boy, Jake murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Nothing makes sense anymore. Martinez returned 15 minutes later, her face pale. We found a fourth body, much older than the others, maybe 10 years buried instead of 20 or 30. The clothing suggests it's a woman. Hard to say precisely without the lab work, but based on decomposition and the clothing style, probably around 2013 or 2014. The timeline hit Jake like a sledgehammer. Sarah's mother, Helen Morrison, had supposedly died in that car accident in 2014, the same accident that had supposedly killed Sarah's father. But now Martinez was telling him that the parents' disappearance had actually been reported in 1994, 20 years earlier. Detective, Jake said slowly, what did Helen Morrison look like? Martinez flipped through her notes. According to the missing person report from '94, she was 5'6", brown hair, scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. The woman you just found. Does she match that description? Why do you ask? Jake walked to the mantel and picked up a framed photo of Sarah with her mother taken just months before Helen's supposed death. In the picture, a distinctive scar was clearly visible on Helen's left hand. Because, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think my wife might have been burying bodies in this yard for 20 years. Marcus couldn't speak. His throat felt like sandpaper as he stared at the tiny bones. Sarah had played in this basement as a child. She'd told him stories about hiding behind the old furnace during thunderstorms, about the games she'd invented to pass the time when her father was in one of his moods. We need to call the state police, Hayes said, pulling out his radio. This is way beyond what my department can handle. While Hayes made his calls, Marcus found himself drawn to the far corner of the basement where Bruno had been digging earlier. The dog sat perfectly still now, watching Marcus with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Marcus knelt and brushed away more loose dirt with his hands, feeling along the foundation wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a child's diary. The pink cover was faded but legible, Amy's secret book. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened it. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with a child's careful handwriting. Daddy says I can't tell anyone about Emma. He says Emma was bad, and that's why she had to go away. But Emma wasn't bad. Emma was my sister, and she was scared of Daddy too. Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. He flipped through more pages, each entry more horrifying than the last. Emma tried to run away, but Daddy caught her. She was crying, and I wanted to help, but Daddy locked me in my room. I heard Emma screaming for a long time, and then it got quiet. Daddy says Emma went to live with angels, but I know that's not true because I saw him carry her down to the basement. Marcus? Hayes's voice seemed to come from very far away. You find something else? Marcus handed him the diary without a word. As Hayes read, his face grew pale in the flashlight's glow. Son of a bitch, he whispered. That bastard killed his own daughter and made Sarah watch. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah had never mentioned a sister. In all their years together, through all their intimate conversations about childhood and family, she'd never said a word about Emma. The weight of that secret, carried alone for so many years, must have been unbearable. This explains a lot, Hayes said grimly. Sarah probably never told you because she was terrified. Kids who witness this kind of trauma sometimes block it out completely, or they're so scared of the perpetrator they never speak up. Marcus thought about Sarah's nightmares, the ones that had plagued her even as an adult. How she'd wake up screaming about dark places and angry voices. How she'd always refused to talk about her father, changing the subject whenever Marcus brought him up. He'd assumed it was just garden-variety family dysfunction, maybe some emotional abuse. Never this. We need to process this scene properly, Hayes continued, already on his radio again. Crime scene techs, coroner, the works. This house is going to be crawling with investigators. Marcus nodded absently, still staring at the diary. Near the back, Sarah's older handwriting appeared. Entries made years later, probably when she was a teenager. I'm moving away tomorrow. I can't stay in this house anymore with Emma still down there. I want to tell someone, but who would believe me? And what if they don't? What if Daddy finds out I told? I have to protect myself now. Emma would understand. She'd want me to survive. The final entry was dated just 2 years ago, shortly after Marcus and Sarah had gotten married. I drove by the old house today. Someone new lives there now. I wanted to tell them about Emma, but I couldn't. I'm still too scared, even with Daddy dead. But maybe someday I'll find the courage. Emma deserves better than being forgotten in that terrible place. She deserves to rest in peace. Marcus closed the diary and looked around the basement with new eyes. Sarah had been planning to tell someone. Maybe that's why she'd been so supportive when he'd decided to rebuild this place. Maybe she'd seen it as an opportunity for Emma to finally be found. Heavy footsteps echoed on the basement stairs as the first of many investigators began to arrive. Marcus picked up Bruno's leash, knowing his work here was done. Sarah's secret was finally coming to light, but he had a feeling the nightmare was just beginning. The basement of the Carmichael house felt like a tomb, the air thick with decades of secrets and the metallic scent of fear. Jake stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a scene that would haunt him forever. Rex whined softly beside him, the German shepherd's instincts telling him this place harbored old evil. The concrete floor was stained with dark patches that could only be blood, dried and oxidized, but still visible after all these years. Against the far wall, metal shelving units held rows of glass jars, each one containing what looked like preserved specimens floating in yellowed liquid. Jake's stomach lurched as he realized some of the shapes were unmistakably human, fingers, teeth, small organs that defied identification in the wavering light. And there, in the center of it all, was a photo of Sarah as a young girl, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the lap of a man Jake didn't recognize. Her eyes held a haunted quality that he'd never seen in any other picture of her childhood. Written beneath it in careful script were the words, "My special helper." Rex's sudden growl snapped Jake back to the present. The dog was staring at the stairs, hackles raised. Jake killed the flashlight and listened, his heart hammering against his ribs. Footsteps creaked overhead, slow and deliberate. Someone was in the house. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake climbed the basement stairs with Rex at his heels. Through the gap under the door, he could see the beam of another flashlight sweeping across the main floor. The intruder was being careful, methodical, searching for something specific. Jake eased the door open just enough to peer through. Detective Morrison stood in the middle of the gutted living room, her back to him as she examined the walls with professional interest. But something was wrong with the picture. She wasn't moving like a cop investigating a crime scene. She moved like someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "I wondered when you'd find this place," Morrison said without turning around. Her voice carried a different quality now, stripped of the professional courtesy she'd shown before. Sarah always was too sentimental for her own good, keeping all those drawings and hiding them where someone might find them. Jake's blood turned to ice. Morrison had known about Sarah's past all along. More than that, she'd been connected to it somehow. "You can come out now, Jake. I know you're there. Your dog gave you away 5 minutes ago." Morrison turned, and in the flashlight's glow, her face looked older, harder. The mask of the concerned detective had slipped away entirely. "We need to talk." Jake stepped into the room, keeping Rex close. "You killed her. What records?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Her father wasn't just a killer, Jake. He was part of something bigger, a network that stretched across 3 states, connected to people you wouldn't believe, politicians, judges, business leaders. Sarah knew things that could have destroyed dozens of powerful men. Morrison's flashlight beam wavered. "When she married you and started talking about rebuilding this place, some people got nervous. They thought she might remember things better left forgotten." The weight of betrayal crushed down on Jake's chest. "So you killed my wife to protect a bunch of pedophiles?" "I killed your wife to protect myself." Morrison's facade cracked completely. "I was supposed to investigate, not solve. I was paid very well to make sure certain evidence never saw daylight. But Sarah started having those dreams again, started asking questions about her childhood. She called me a week before she died, wanting to know what happened to the investigation into her father's activities." Rex's growl deepened, and Jake realized Morrison's hand was moving toward her weapon. The basement full of horrors suddenly seemed like the safer option compared to standing here with a corrupt cop who'd already killed once to keep her secrets buried. Everything Sarah had endured, every nightmare that had plagued her adult life, every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her past, it all came down to this moment in the ruins of her childhood hell. The basement felt like a tomb, the air thick with decades of trapped secrets and the metallic tang of old blood. Jack stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal horrors that made his stomach lurch. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of young women, their faces captured in moments of terror that would haunt him forever. Rex whined softly beside him, pressing against his leg as if sensing the evil that permeated this underground chamber. Jack's hand trembled as he moved the light across the makeshift altar in the center of the room, where candles had melted into grotesque shapes around what looked like personal belongings, jewelry, locks of hair, items that had once meant something to someone who would never come home. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Behind him, footsteps creaked on the wooden stairs. Jack spun around, his heart hammering as Detective Morrison descended into the nightmare they'd uncovered. The detective's face went pale in the flashlight's glow, her professional composure cracking as she took in the scene. "We need backup," she said quietly into her radio. "And the forensics team. All of them." Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from one particular photograph pinned to the far wall. The girl looked so much like Sarah, the same delicate features, the same haunted eyes. But it wasn't his wife. This girl was younger, maybe 16, wearing a high school uniform that looked decades old. "That's Margaret Chen," Morrison said, following his gaze. "She disappeared in 1987. Her case went cold after 6 months. How many?" Jack's voice cracked on the words. Morrison moved slowly around the room, her flashlight revealing more horrors with each step. I count at least 20 photographs, maybe more. She paused at a wooden cabinet, its doors hanging open to reveal rows of mason jars filled with objects Jack didn't want to identify. This has been going on for a long time. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside filtered down through the floorboards above them. Soon, the quiet house would be swarming with investigators, photographers, and forensic specialists who would spend weeks cataloging every piece of evidence in this chamber of horrors. Jack sank onto an overturned crate, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Rex immediately moved to his side, the dog's warm presence the only thing keeping him anchored to sanity. "Sarah knew," he said finally. "She had to have known something." Morrison nodded grimly. "The question is whether she was a victim who escaped or—" She didn't finish the thought, but Jack heard it anyway. The possibility that his wife might have been involved, might have been complicit in whatever had happened in this house, threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd loved. Heavy footsteps thundered overhead as the first responders entered the house. Within minutes, the basement filled with people, their voices a constant murmur as they began the methodical process of documenting the crime scene. Jack found himself pushed to the periphery, no longer needed now that the professionals had taken over. He climbed the stairs with Rex, emerging into the kitchen, where the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. Detective Morrison followed them up, her face grim as she pulled out her notebook. "I need to ask you some questions," she said. "About Sarah's childhood, her family, anything she might have told you about growing up in this house." Jack rubbed his temples, trying to think through the fog of shock and revulsion. She never talked about it much, said her parents died when she was young, that she was raised by her grandmother, always changed the subject when I asked for details. "What about visitors? Anyone who might have had access to the house over the years?" "She inherited it from her grandmother maybe 5 years ago, said she could never bring herself to come back here, that it held too many bad memories. I thought she meant losing her parents." Jack's laugh was bitter and hollow. Guess the memories were a lot worse than that. Through the kitchen window, he could see neighbors gathering on the street, their faces curious and alarmed as more police vehicles arrived. The same people who had mocked his renovation efforts just days ago now stood watching as their quiet street transformed into the center of a major criminal investigation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard where Rex had first caught the scent that started this nightmare, Jack realized his life had changed forever. Whatever he'd hoped to find by rebuilding Sarah's childhood home, it wasn't this. Some secrets, he now understood, were buried for good reason. Bruno padded up beside him, the German shepherd's presence a constant comfort. The dog had become something of a local celebrity, though Marcus suspected the attention made Bruno uncomfortable. Children would point and whisper about the hero dog when they passed on their bikes, and Marcus had fielded calls from 2 different news stations wanting to do follow-up stories. He'd declined them all. The house stood complete now, every board and shingle exactly as Sarah had described from her childhood memories. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd rebuilt her sanctuary while unknowingly sitting atop her greatest nightmare. The basement had been sealed and filled with concrete. Per the police investigation's conclusion, 43 sets of remains had been recovered in total, spanning nearly 2 decades of Harold Winter's killing spree. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house across the street, moving with the careful steps of someone still processing trauma. She'd aged visibly in recent weeks. The discovery that she'd lived next door to a serial killer for years, etching new lines around her eyes. But she still brought Marcus casseroles twice a week, as if feeding him could somehow restore normalcy to their shattered neighborhood. "Morning, Marcus," she called, raising a tentative hand. He nodded back, appreciating that she'd stopped apologizing for her earlier hostility. They'd all been suspicious of the wrong person, but dwelling on it served no purpose now. The real estate sign in the Kowalski yard fluttered in the breeze. They'd been the first to put their house on the market, followed quickly by the Hendersons and old Mr. Vance. Marcus understood their need to escape, but Maple Street felt different to him now, not cursed but cleansed. Sarah's truth had finally surfaced, and with it, justice for dozens of forgotten victims. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. Winters pled guilty to all counts. Life without parole. Thought you should know. Marcus stared at the message, feeling an unexpected emptiness where satisfaction should have been. Harold Winters would die in prison, but that couldn't resurrect Sarah or explain why she'd never trusted him with her darkest secret. That question would haunt him longer than any buried bones. Bruno suddenly perked up, ears forward, and Marcus followed his gaze to see a small sedan pulling into the driveway. A woman emerged, late 30s, nervous energy, clutching a manila folder. She approached with hesitant steps. "Mr. Cole? I'm Jennifer Walsh. I think you knew my sister." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same green eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw that Sarah had when she was determined about something. "Your sister?" "Amy Walsh. She went missing in 2019. Jennifer's voice caught. "The police called yesterday. They identified her remains from under your house." The folder trembled in her hands, and Marcus gently guided her to the porch chairs he'd built just last month. Bruno settled at her feet, somehow sensing her need for comfort. "Amy was hiking through the area when she disappeared," Jennifer continued. "She was documenting abandoned houses for some photography project. The police think she stumbled onto Winter's property by mistake." She opened the folder, revealing photos of a young woman with bright eyes and an adventurous smile. "I wanted to thank you, and your dog, for finding her, for bringing her home." They sat in silence for several minutes, two strangers bound by grief and circumstance. Marcus thought about all the other families who would receive similar closure, thanks to Bruno's determined digging. It didn't diminish the horror of what had happened, but it offered something Sarah herself had never received, the peace of knowing. "Would you like to see where we found her?" Marcus asked finally. Jennifer nodded, wiping her eyes. "She's not alone anymore," Jennifer whispered. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself sharing stories about the rebuilding process, about Sarah's memories of this place, about the strange journey that had led to truth. Jennifer listened with the intensity of someone storing every detail, and when she finally left, she pressed his hand with genuine gratitude. Darkness settled over Maple Street, and Marcus sat on his completed porch, Bruno at his side. Tomorrow he would start his next project, not rebuilding the past, but constructing something new. Sarah's truth had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. The secrets were buried now, replaced by something honest and clean. The house stood solid around them, no longer haunted by what lay beneath.